Three masked men thought they were sending a message to the new black homeowner in their neighborhood. They never expected he'd be a state senator, but that's not even the biggest surprise waiting for them. David Miller stood in front of his new home with his hands on his hips. The moving truck rumbled behind him. The house was bigger than any place he had ever lived. 2 stories tall with deep blue paint and bright white trim around the windows. It sat at the top of Hill Street, looking down on all the other houses. "You sure you want all these boxes in the living room, sir?" asked the mover, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Yes, thank you," David said with a smile. "I'll sort through them myself." David watched as the movers carried the last of his things into the house. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky orange and pink. As he looked around, he noticed curtains moving in the windows of nearby homes. Eyes peeked out at him. No one waved or came to say hello. David took a deep breath and walked up the steps to his front door. The wood creaked under his feet. He ran his hand along the smooth porch railing. This was his now. All his. After all these years, he whispered to himself. Inside, boxes were stacked everywhere. David walked through the big empty rooms, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. This house had 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and a kitchen bigger than his first apartment. He still couldn't believe it was his. He found the box marked Photos and carefully cut it open. On top was a picture of a woman with a bright smile and kind eyes. His wife, Elaine. David touched the glass gently. "Wish you could see this place," he said softly. "You always said we'd have a home like this someday." 2 years since cancer took her, and some days the pain felt as fresh as ever. He placed the photo on the fireplace mantel, then added more family pictures. His daughter, Zoe, in her high school graduation cap. Family vacations at the beach. Happy memories to fill this new space. As the sky grew darker, David turned on lights in every room. The house seemed less empty that way. He unpacked his sheets and made the bed in the master bedroom. Tomorrow would be a big day at his new job, and he needed rest. Before heading upstairs, David walked through the house, checking each window and door. He tested the locks twice, making sure everything was secure. Old habits were hard to break. In his line of work, you could never be too careful. He paused at the large bay window in the living room and looked out at the neighborhood below. Neat houses with perfect lawns lined both sides of the street. In some windows, he could see families eating dinner together or watching TV. No one looked up at his house. David's phone rang, breaking the silence. The caller ID read, "Governor's Office." "Hello, this is David," he answered, his voice changing to a more formal tone. "Just checking that you're settled in before the big meeting tomorrow," said the voice on the other end. "The committee is eager to meet you." "I'll be prepared, sir," David said. "This position means a lot to me." "You earned it. Get some rest." After hanging up, David walked upstairs to his new bedroom. It was nearly twice the size of his old one, with tall windows and a small balcony that overlooked the backyard. He placed his wallet and keys on the nightstand, next to a small framed photo of his parents. "Look at me now, Mama," he whispered with a smile. As he got ready for bed, David heard a car drive slowly past his house. He peeked through the curtains, but could only see taillights disappearing down the hill. Probably just someone lost, or turning around, he thought. He climbed into bed and stared at the unfamiliar ceiling. This house represented everything he had worked for his entire life. From the small apartment he grew up in to this big house on the hill. His mother had cleaned houses like this one. Now her son owned one. But as proud as he felt, a knot of worry sat in his stomach. He'd felt the stairs today, seen the curtains moving. No welcome wagons or friendly neighbors bringing cookies. David knew what they were thinking. What is a man like him doing in a neighborhood like this? He rolled over and looked at his wife's photo on the nightstand. "I did it, Elaine," he whispered. "But I sure wish you were here with me." Tomorrow would be his first day representing this district. The first day of making real change. He needed to be rested and sharp. As sleep began to take him, David had one last thought. This house isn't just for me. It's for everyone who never thought someone like me could live here. Outside his window, the stars twinkled over the big house on the hill. Inside, David Miller slept, unaware of the storm that was brewing in his new neighborhood. The Thirsty Fox bar sat at the edge of town, its neon sign flickering in the darkness. Inside, the smell of spilled beer and fried food filled the air. 3 men huddled around a small table in the corner, their voices low but angry. "Did you see who moved into the old Wilson place?" Denny Miller asked, his thick fingers wrapped around a beer mug. His face was red, either from the alcohol or his anger. Maybe both. "Yeah, I saw the moving truck," said Tom Barker, the youngest of the 3. "My wife said he's some big shot from the city." Rick Powell, thin with graying hair, took a sip of his drink. "What's the big deal? The house has been empty for months." Denny leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The big deal is that our neighborhood is changing. First it's one of them, then more come. Property values drop. You know how it goes." Tom nodded quickly. "My sister's neighborhood in the city went that way. Now she's stuck in a house worth half what she paid." Rick shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We don't even know the guy. Maybe he's nice." "Nice?" Denny snorted. "Doesn't matter if he's nice. He doesn't belong there. That's a fact." The bartender brought another round of beers. When he left, Denny leaned in closer. "I think we should send a message," he said. "Let him know this neighborhood has standards." Tom's eyes widened. "What kind of message?" "Just a little welcome gift," Denny said with a cold smile. Something to help him understand he picked the wrong street. Rick frowned. "I don't know, Denny. Sounds like trouble." "No trouble if we're careful," Denny said. "We wear masks, go late at night, break a few windows, spray paint a little message on his fancy house. He'll get the point." "What if he calls the cops?" Rick asked. "By the time they show up, we'll be long gone," Denny said. "Besides, those city cops don't care about a broken window." Tom took a long drink. "My cousin got arrested for something like that last year." "Your cousin is an idiot," Denny said. "We'll be smart about it." Rick looked down at his beer. He'd known Denny since high school. 20 years ago, they were football stars. Now they were middle-aged men with beer bellies and failing businesses. Maybe that's why Denny was so angry all the time. "I don't know anything about this guy except that he's—" Rick's voice trailed off. "Black," Denny finished the sentence. "That's all we need to know. He's not like us, and he needs to understand that Hill Street isn't for his kind." The bar had gotten more crowded, and a group of young people started playing loud music on the jukebox. Denny had to lean closer to be heard. "Tomorrow night, after midnight. I'll bring the spray paint." Tom nodded eagerly. "I have masks from that Halloween party last year." Rick still looked unsure. "What if he has a security system?" "Those fancy systems just take pictures," Denny said. "That's why we wear masks." They clinked their glasses together, but Rick's hand was shaky. This didn't feel right, but he didn't want to look weak in front of Denny. He never did. The men finished their drinks and stepped out into the cool night air. The stars that twinkled over David Miller's new home also shone down on these three men as they made their ugly plans. "Remember," Denny said, as they walked to their cars, "we're protecting our homes, our neighborhood, our way of life." Tom nodded. "My kids play on that street." Rick said nothing. He thought about his wife at home, how she'd be ashamed if she knew what he was planning. But he also thought about how Denny would call him weak if he backed out, how the whole town would hear about it. "Tomorrow night," Denny reminded them. "Meet at my garage at 11. We'll wait until the neighborhood is asleep." As they drove away in separate cars, Rick looked up at the hill where the big house stood. A single light was still on inside. Someone was awake up there, unaware of the hatred brewing below. Back at home, Rick's wife was waiting up for him. "You smell like beer," she said, frowning. "Just a couple with the guys," he answered, not meeting her eyes. "Did you talk about the new neighbor? Mrs. Peterson said he drove a really nice car." Rick nodded. "Yeah, we talked about him." He didn't tell her the rest. How could he explain the darkness that had filled that bar tonight? The ugly words, the terrible plan. Instead, he kissed her cheek and went to bed, hoping he might find the courage to stand up to Denny before tomorrow night. The state capitol building gleamed white in the morning sun. David Miller climbed the steps, briefcase in hand. His new suit fit perfectly, and his shoes shone with a fresh polish. First impressions mattered, especially today. Inside, the marble floors echoed with his footsteps. A security guard nodded respectfully. "Good morning, sir," the guard said, checking David's ID badge. "First day?" "That's right," David replied, with a smile. "You'll want the East Wing, 3rd floor. The committee is meeting in room 307. David thanked him and walked through the grand hallway. Portraits of past governors and senators lined the walls, serious faces in fancy frames. Not many of them looked like him. At the elevator, a woman in a gray suit greeted him. "Senator Miller, I'm Lisa Martinez, your chief of staff." "Nice to meet you in person, Lisa," David said, shaking her hand. "The governor is excited you're here," Lisa said, as they rode the elevator to the 3rd floor. "Your work on housing reform in the city really impressed him." "I'm just getting started," David replied. "There's a lot of work to do." Room 307 was a large meeting room with a long wooden table. Men and women in suits looked up when David entered. Some smiled warmly. Others just stared. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced an older man at the head of the table, "please welcome our newest state, Senator David Miller." Polite applause filled the room. David took his seat, feeling all eyes on him. "Senator Miller will be taking over for Senator Wilson, who retired last month," the man continued. "He'll be representing District 5, which includes Hill Street and the surrounding areas." The morning passed in a blur of introductions and meetings, budget discussions, upcoming votes, committee assignments. David took careful notes and asked smart questions. By lunchtime, several colleagues had invited him to dinner or coffee. "You're making quite an impression," Lisa told him as they ate lunch in his new office. Senator Parker never invites new people to his dinner parties. "I need to make allies quickly," David said. "Some of these housing laws need to change now, not next year." Lisa nodded. "The governor mentioned you bought a house in your district. That's rare these days." "I believe in living where I serve," David said. "Can't understand people's needs from a distance." After lunch came more meetings. David presented his ideas for new housing laws that would help poor families. Most senators listened carefully, but a few frowned and whispered to each other. At 4 o'clock, David finally had a break. He closed his office door and called his daughter. "Hey, Zoe," he said when she answered. How are classes today?" "Dad!" Zoe's voice brightened. "I was just thinking about you. How's the new house?" "Big and empty," David laughed. "You need to. Visit soon and help me decorate. Your mom always had the eye for that stuff." A moment of silence fell between them at the mention of Elaine. "I miss her too, Dad," Zoe said softly. "She would have loved that house." "The neighbors are interesting," David said, changing the subject. "Nobody came to say hello yesterday, just watched from behind their curtains." "Give them time," Zoe said. "Or maybe they're just starstruck. Not every day a state senator moves in next door." "Nobody there knows that yet," David reminded her. "I'm just the new guy who doesn't look like them." "Well, you worked hard for that house," Zoe said firmly. "Don't let anyone make you feel unwelcome." After hanging up, David stared out his office window at the Capitol grounds below. His daughter was right. He had worked too hard to feel unwelcome anywhere. The afternoon meeting ran long, and it was after 7 when David finally headed home. The sun was setting as he drove up Hill Street. His house stood tall against the darkening sky as he parked. In the driveway, David noticed a man watching from across the street. When David waved, the man quickly went inside. The house felt even emptier in the evening. David warmed up a frozen dinner and ate alone at his big dining room table. Tomorrow, he would buy some plants, he decided, something living to keep him company. After dinner, he unpacked a few more boxes, family photos, books, and his collection of jazz records. Small pieces of his old life to make this new place feel like home. As he placed the last book on a shelf, David noticed a car driving slowly past his house. It was the third time tonight. Maybe just people curious about their new neighbor, he thought. Or maybe something else. David pulled the curtains closed and turned on the porch light. He double-checked the new security system he'd had installed last week, all working perfectly. Upstairs, he changed into a t-shirt and sweatpants. The serious senator now just a tired man, ready for sleep. As he brushed his teeth, David looked at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. First day down, he told himself. Making changes takes time. But somewhere deep inside, he wondered if some things ever really changed at all. Denny Miller's garage smelled like oil and old wood. Tools hung neatly on the wall. A broken lawnmower sat in the corner. 3 folding chairs formed a small circle in the middle of the concrete floor. "Grab a beer," Denny told Rick and Tom as they walked in. He pointed to a red cooler by the workbench. The clock on the wall read 11:15 p.m. Rick took a can, but didn't open it. His stomach felt tight and sick. All day he had thought about calling Denny to back out, but each time he picked up the phone, he put it down again. What would he say? That he was scared? That he knew this was wrong? "My wife almost caught me leaving," Tom said, opening his beer. At 28, he was 12 years younger than Rick and Denny. "Told her I forgot something at work." "She believe you?" Denny asked. "She never questions me," Tom said proudly. "That's how a marriage should be." Rick thought about his own wife, how she'd looked at him all day like she knew something was wrong, how she'd asked, "Are you feeling okay?" And he'd lied and said he was just tired. Denny pulled a gym bag from under his workbench and unzipped it. "Got everything we need right here." He took out 3 cans of black spray paint, a small crowbar, and a baseball bat. "What's the bat for?" Rick asked, his mouth suddenly dry. "Just in case," Denny said with a shrug. "Don't worry. We're just gonna scare him, break some stuff, and leave a message. In and out in 5 minutes." Tom reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out 3 Halloween masks. A zombie, a skull, and a monster with red eyes. "Only ones I could find," he, explained, passing them around. Halloween stores close this time of year. Rick held the zombie mask in his hands, green plastic with fake blood around the mouth. His kids had worn masks like this for fun. Nothing about tonight felt fun. Denny took a long drink of beer, then crushed the can in his fist. Let me tell you why we're doing this. Rick and Tom sat quietly as Denny started talking about how the neighborhood used to be, about his father and grandfather living there, about keeping things the way they should be. My dad would roll over in his grave if he saw who was living in that house now, Denny said, his face getting redder. People like that don't belong here. They don't share our values. What do we really know about him? Rick asked quietly. Know enough, Denny snapped. Fancy car, fancy clothes. Probably thinks he's better than us. Well, after tonight, he'll learn this neighborhood has rules. Tom nodded eagerly, already on his third beer. Yeah, rules. Rick looked down at the mask, in his hands. What exactly are we going to write on his house? Just a simple message, Denny said. Something like, "Get out," should do the trick. The words made Rick's skin cold. He remembered his grandfather telling him about signs like that from the old days. Signs meant to scare people away just because of their skin color. His grandfather hadn't been proud of those stories. It's almost midnight, Denny said, checking his watch. We'll drive by first to make sure his lights are off, then park down the street and walk up from behind the houses. There's a path through the woods. They finished their beers in silence. With each passing minute, Rick felt worse, but he still said nothing, still followed as they walked to Denny's truck, the supplies hidden in a black garbage bag. The truck's engine seemed too loud in the quiet night. Rick sat by the passenger window, watching dark houses pass by. Most people in town were asleep now, unaware of what was happening. When they reached Hill Street, Denny drove slowly past the big house. On top, most windows were dark, but a small light shone from upstairs. Bedroom light, Denny whispered. He'll be asleep soon. They parked 3 streets away and waited in the truck. Tom kept checking his phone. Put that away, Denny hissed. The light from the screen can be seen from outside. At 12:30, Denny decided it was time. Remember, we go in fast, do the job, and get out. No talking once we're there. If you need to say something, whisper. They pulled the masks over their heads. Rick's breath felt hot inside the plastic. His heart pounded so hard he was sure the others could hear it. Let's go, Denny said, grabbing the garbage bag. They walked through a narrow path between houses, then up a wooded hill behind the big house. Crickets chirped in the darkness. An owl hooted somewhere above them. Every sound made Rick jump. From the woods, they could see the back of David Miller's house. The windows were dark now. The security light on the porch cast long shadows across the lawn. There, Denny whispered, pointing to a back window. We'll start there. As they crept closer to the house, Rick noticed a small blinking light near the back door. Red, then green, then red again. A security system. Rick opened his mouth to warn the others, but no words came out. Part of him hoped they would get caught. Then this would be over. Denny moved toward the house like a man on a mission, the baseball bat gripped tight in his fist. Tom followed close behind with the spray paint, and Rick, despite every good voice in his head telling him to turn around, followed too. David Miller sat alone at his dining room table. His dinner plate held the remains of a frozen lasagna, not nearly as good as the ones Elaine used to make from scratch. She would have hated seeing him eat like this. I know, he said to the empty room. I'll learn to cook real food soon. The house creaked and settled around him. Big houses made more noises than apartments, he was learning. Every pop and groan made him look up from his papers. After clearing his plate, David spread out folders. Across the table, housing reports, budget numbers, and law drafts. His first big speech was next week, and he needed to be ready. Affordable housing isn't just a city problem, he practiced saying out loud. It affects every community in our state. His voice bounced off the empty walls. Maybe he should get a dog, he thought. Something else living to talk to. Elaine had always wanted a golden retriever. At 9 o'clock, David took a break. He walked around the house, turning on lights in different rooms before turning them off again. Part of him still couldn't believe this place was his. 5 bedrooms for one person seemed silly, but someday Zoe might move back after college. Maybe bring grandchildren someday. In the kitchen, David made a cup of tea and stood by the window. He could see lights from other houses down the hill. TV screens flickering blue through windows, cars in driveways. Normal family life going on without him. His security app pinged on his phone. Someone walking past the front of his house. The video showed a woman walking a small dog. Nothing to worry about. Still, David was glad he had spent the extra money on the good security system. Back at the dining table, he returned to his work. Housing costs had gone up 60% in 5 years, but paychecks had only grown by 12%. How were regular families supposed to live? The numbers made him angry every time he looked at them. This stops now, he told himself. This is why I ran for office. By 11, his eyes were getting heavy. David gathered his papers and put them neatly back into folders. Tomorrow would be another long day at the Capitol. Upstairs, he went through his nighttime routine. Brush teeth, wash face, check the security app one more time. In his bedroom, David changed into a gray t-shirt and blue pajama pants. On the nightstand, Elaine smiled at him from their wedding photo. Next to it sat a stack of books he was trying to find time to read. "Good night, honey," he said to the photo. "Miss you every day." He picked up the top book, a biography of Justice Thurgood Marshall, and opened to his bookmarked page. The story of Marshall's fight for equal rights always inspired David. On tough days, he remembered how much harder others had it before him. As he read, his eyelids grew heavier. The book slowly lowered to his chest. His breathing became deep and even. Just before sleep took him completely, a noise outside made David open his eyes. Probably just the wind, he thought. The forecast had mentioned a storm coming tomorrow. He placed the book on his nightstand and turned off the lamp. Darkness filled the room except for the small green light of the security system panel by his door. In the dark, David thought about his first 2 days in this house. The neighbors still hadn't come to welcome him. At his old apartment, Mrs. Rivera from next door had brought homemade empanadas the day he moved in. Here, just curious stares from behind curtains. Give it time, he told himself. Change doesn't happen overnight. He thought about his new colleagues at the Capitol building. Some seemed truly happy to work with him. Others clearly had doubts. Could a man from his background really understand their issues? Could he represent this wealthy district? Just wait, he whispered into the darkness. Just wait and see what I can do. As sleep finally claimed him, David dreamed of his childhood, home. The small apartment where his mother had raised him alone. How she would come home tired from cleaning other people's houses, but still help him with homework. How she had pointed to houses on the hill and told him, "Someday, David, someday, you'll live there." In his dream, his mother stood on the porch of his new house, smiling proudly at what her son had become. Outside the window, 3 shadows moved across his lawn, coming closer to the house with each step. The security system blinked quietly. Green, then red, then green again, ready to do its job when needed. David slept on, unaware of the danger creeping toward his new home, unaware that tonight would change everything for him and for the 3 men who thought they were about to teach him a lesson. The night was quiet on Hill Street. A few porch lights glowed in the darkness. Most windows were dark, the families inside, fast asleep. A cat prowled along a fence, hunting for mice in the shadows. Denny's truck sat parked 3 streets away, hidden under the branches of an old oak tree. The 3 men moved through backyards, staying low and out of sight. Their masks made it hard to see in the dark. "Watch out for that flower bed," Denny's whispered as Tom nearly tripped over a garden border. "We don't need to wake up the whole neighborhood." Rick followed a few steps behind. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. The zombie mask was hot and smelled like plastic. Through the eye holes, the world looked strange and unreal. Maybe that was why he was still here, he thought. Maybe this didn't feel real enough to stop. They reached the edge of David Miller's property. The big house loomed above them, dark and quiet. No lights shone from inside. "He's asleep," Denny whispered. "Perfect timing." From his pocket, Denny pulled out a pair of gloves and put them on. He handed pairs to Rick and Tom. "No fingerprints," he explained. "Not that they'll try very hard to find who did this, but no need to make it easy for them." Tom tightened his skull mask and opened his jacket. 3 cans of spray paint clinked together inside. "Ready?" Denny asked. Tom nodded eagerly. Rick gave a small nod, though everything inside him screamed to run away. "Remember," Denny said, his voice low and serious, "we're doing this for our neighborhood, for our families. People have to learn they can't just move in where they don't belong." Rick thought about his 2 kids, sleeping safely in their beds at home. Would they be proud of what their father was doing tonight? The thought made him feel sick. "I'll take the front," Denny continued, gripping the baseball bat. "Tom, you start on the garage door with the paint. Rick, you take the side windows with these." He handed Rick a small bag of rocks. "What about the security system?" Rick whispered, pointing to the small camera above the back door. "That's why we have masks," Denny said, tapping his monster face. "Let's go. Quick and quiet until we're ready to make noise." They split up, moving around the house like shadows. Rick crept along the side wall, the bag of rocks heavy in his hand. Through the windows, he could see shapes of furniture in the darkness. This was someone's home, someone's safe place, just like his own. On the other side of the house, Tom shook a can of spray paint. The little ball inside rattled loudly in the quiet night. "Hurry up," Denny hissed from the front porch. "Let's do this and get out of here." Rick reached the first, side window, large and gleaming in the moonlight. Inside was what looked like a dining room. Papers spread across a big table. Someone had been working late. His hand shook as he took out the first rock. It felt cold and wrong in his palm. At the front of the house, Denny raised the baseball bat. For a moment, he stood there frozen, like he was having second thoughts. Then his body seemed to fill with new anger. He swung the bat hard against the front window. Crash! The sound of breaking glass shattered the night's silence. Instantly, lights began flashing all around the house, red and blue, bright and blinding. A loud alarm wailed into the darkness. "Go! Go! Go!" Denny shouted, no longer trying to be quiet. He smashed another window with his bat. Tom began spraying wildly on the garage door. Black paint dripped down the white surface as he wrote, "Get out." Rick stood frozen, the rock still in his hand. The key. Security lights caught him in their glow, making him squint behind his mask. Above him, a bedroom light flicked on. "What are you waiting for?" Denny shouted at him. "Do it!" Rick's arm moved without his brain's permission. The rock flew from his hand and crashed through the dining room window. Glass exploded inward, landing on the papers across the table. "Again!" Denny commanded. Inside the house, they could hear movement now. Someone was awake. Someone was coming. Tom finished his message on the garage and ran to the front yard. "We need to go," he called, his voice high with panic. "Not yet," Denny growled. He pulled a can of spray paint from his pocket and began writing on the front. "Door!" The alarm continued to scream into the night. Lights were turning on in nearby houses. Neighbors were waking up. "Denny, we need to leave," Rick pleaded, finding his voice at last. "This has gone far enough." "We're sending a message," Denny insisted, still spraying, making sure he knows he's not welcome here. Inside the house, footsteps pounded downstairs. A deep voice called out, "Who's there?" "He's coming," Tom said, already backing away. "I'm out of here." "Coward," Denny shouted after him. Rick threw down the bag of rocks. "This is wrong, Denny. It's always been wrong." But Denny wasn't listening. Something had taken over him, some rage that wouldn't be satisfied with just broken windows. He walked to the side door and began kicking it hard. "You don't belong here," he shouted through his mask. "This isn't your neighborhood." The door wasn't locking properly. After 3 kicks, it splintered around the handle. With a 4th kick, it flew open. "What are you doing?" Rick gasped. "Breaking in wasn't part of the plan." "Plans change," Denny said, stepping inside the house. Rick stood in the yard, torn between running away and following Denny to stop him from doing something even worse. From down the street, he could hear sirens. Someone had called the police. Through the broken dining room window, Rick saw Denny swing his bat at a bookshelf inside. Books flew across the room. "Stop it!" Rick called, finally finding his courage. "This isn't right." But his words were drowned by the alarm, the sirens, and the sound of someone coming down the hallway inside the house. With a deep breath, Rick pulled off his mask and stepped through the broken side door. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't hide his face anymore. The sound of breaking glass jolted David from his sleep. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. Then the security alarm started blaring, and red lights flashed across his bedroom ceiling. David sat up quickly, his heart racing. This was real. Someone was breaking into his house. He reached for his phone on the nightstand and saw alert notifications lighting up the screen. Motion detected. Glass break detected. Multiple zones triggered. With shaking hands, he tapped the security app. Video feeds showed shadowy figures moving around his house. Masked men. 3 of them. "Not again," David whispered. This wasn't the EOU. First time he'd faced hatred. But it was the first time it had come to his doorstep. He opened the drawer of his nightstand and removed a small lockbox. His fingers quickly worked the combination. Inside was a handgun, legally registered and kept for protection. David had hoped he would never need to use it. He didn't load the gun, but he did take it out. Just having it made him feel safer. With his other hand, he called 911. 911, what's your emergency? A woman's voice answered. This is David Miller, he said, trying to keep his voice calm. I'm at 1487 Hill Street. There are intruders breaking into my home. 3 men with masks. Are you safe, sir? The dispatcher asked. I'm upstairs, but... "They're inside the house now," David said, hearing more glass breaking downstairs. "Please hurry." "Are you the new resident on Hill Street?" the dispatcher asked, typing sounds coming through the phone. "Yes," David replied, wondering why that mattered now. "Officers are on their way," she assured him. "Stay on the line if possible. Find a secure location in your home." David moved to his bedroom door and locked it. Through the wood, he could hear shouting downstairs. Angry voices calling out terrible words, words he hadn't heard spoken aloud in years. "Get out of our neighborhood! You don't belong here!" The old, familiar hate. The same hate that had followed him his whole life, no matter how high he climbed, no matter what he achieved. David took a deep breath. He knew he had two choices: hide in his room until the police arrived, or face these men. Show them who they were really attacking. The decision wasn't hard. David Miller had never been one to hide. He unlocked his bedroom door and stepped into the hallway, gun pointed at the floor. He could see broken glass glittering on the stairs. Downstairs, someone was smashing things. The sound of books hitting the floor. Pictures being knocked from walls. "I can hear the police coming," David called out, his voice steady and strong. "They'll be here any minute." The noise stopped for a second. Then a voice shouted back, "We're just delivering a message. This neighborhood has standards." David began walking down the stairs, one careful step at a time. The alarm continued to scream around him. Through the broken front window, he could see lights coming on in houses across the street. Neighbors watching. Always watching. Never helping. "What kind of message requires breaking into someone's home?" David called out. "What kind of men hide behind masks?" He reached the bottom of the stairs and paused in the hallway. From here, he could see into the living room. A man in a monster mask stood there, a baseball bat in his hand. The man froze when he saw David. "You're supposed to be asleep," the man said, his voice muffled by the mask. "Sorry to disappoint you," David replied. Another masked man appeared from the dining room, this one wearing a zombie face. But strangely, this man was holding the mask in his hand, not wearing it. His real face was visible, pale, scared, and ashamed. "Denny, that's enough," the unmasked man said. "Let's go before the police come." "Not until he gets our message," the monster-faced man, Denny, replied, gripping his bat tighter. David stepped forward into the light of the living room. "I think I understand your message clearly. It's an old message, one I've heard before." Denny seemed startled by David's calm. "You need to understand, this neighborhood isn't for your kind." "And what kind is that?" David asked. "You know what I mean," Denny growled. The unmasked man spoke again, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry. This was wrong. We shouldn't be here." "Rick, shut up!" Denny snapped. Outside, sirens wailed closer. Blue and red lights flashed through the broken windows, painting the walls with color. "That'll be the police," David said. "I suggest you put down that bat before things get worse for you." "You called the cops on us?" Denny sounded shocked, as if breaking into a home shouldn't have consequences. "Of course he called the cops," Rick said. "What did you expect?" The front door burst open, and a third man ran in, still wearing a skull mask. "The police are here. We need to go now." "Tom, you coward," Denny hissed. "You ran away when things got real." David raised his voice. "I am the homeowner here. This is my property that you've damaged. These are my possessions you've destroyed." Denny pointed the bat at David. "You don't belong in this house." "Actually," David said calmly, "I believe you're the ones who don't belong in this house, and I'd like you to leave now." "Who do you think you are?" Denny demanded. Before David could answer, police officers rushed through the open front door, weapons drawn. "Police! Everyone on the ground now!" An officer shouted. The skull-masked man, Tom, immediately dropped to his knees, hands in the air. Rick was already placing his hands behind his head, his face full of regret. Only Denny remained defiant, bat still in hand. "Sir, drop the weapon now," an officer ordered, pointing his gun at Denny. After a tense moment, Denny let the bat clatter to the floor. As an officer pushed him down and handcuffed him, he kept his angry eyes on David. The officers looked around the room, taking in the broken windows, the spray-painted threats visible through the doorway, the scattered books and broken picture frames. Then one officer looked at David, really looked at him, and his eyes went wide with recognition. "Senator Miller, are you okay, sir?" The words hung in the air. Denny's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock behind his mask. Tom stopped struggling against his handcuffs. Rick closed his eyes, as if the word senator had physically hit him. "I'm unharmed, Officer Chen," David said, recognizing the policeman. "Thank you for responding so quickly." "Senator?" Denny's voice cracked. An officer removed his monster mask, revealing a red face dripping with sweat. "You're a senator?" David nodded calmly. "State Senator David Miller. I represent this district, which includes Hill Street and surrounding areas." The room fell, silent except for the fading alarm. Even the officers seemed unsure what to say next. One of them stepped forward, a tall woman with a serious face. "I'm Sergeant Willis," she said. "We'll need statements from everyone. Senator, would you like to sit down, sir? This must be very upsetting." David looked around at his damaged home. Broken glass covered the floor. Books lay scattered where they'd been knocked from shelves. Through the doorway, he could see the hateful words spray-painted on his garage door. "I'm fine, Sergeant," he said, "but I would like to understand why these men felt the need to attack my home." Sergeant Willis nodded to her officers, who began leading the handcuffed men to separate corners of the room. One tried to take Denny outside, but David raised his hand. "If you don't mind, I'd like to speak with this gentleman first." The officer looked at Sergeant Willis, who nodded her approval. David walked over to Denny, stopping a few feet away. Up close, Denny seemed smaller somehow. Less frightening without his mask and bat. "Why?" David asked simply. Denny's eyes darted around, not meeting David's gaze. "We didn't know who you were. Would it have mattered? If I wasn't a senator, would that make this okay?" Denny had no answer. "My name is on the mailbox," David continued. "Did you check? Or was my skin color all you needed to see?" From across the room, Rick spoke up. "It was wrong. All of it. We shouldn't have done this to anyone, senator or not." His voice shook with regret. David turned to Rick. "At least you took your mask off. That took some courage." "Not enough," Rick said quietly. "Not soon enough." Outside, more police cars arrived. Through the broken window, David could see neighbors gathering on the street in robes and pajamas. Watching. Always. Watching? Sergeant Willis approached again. "Senator, we need to process these men. They'll be charged with breaking and entering, vandalism, property damage, and given the nature of the graffiti, possibly hate crimes." "I understand," David said. "I'll press charges." "The county attorney will want to talk to you personally. This kind of attack on a state official—" "I wasn't attacked as a state official," David interrupted. "These men didn't know who I was. They attacked me because of what I look like. Let's be clear about that." Tom, still wearing his skull mask, finally spoke up. "Can someone take this?" Off me? Please? An officer removed his mask, revealing a young face streaked with tears. "I'm sorry," he said. "I just followed along. I didn't think we'd really break in. But you were fine with breaking my windows and spray-painting threats?" David asked. Tom looked at the floor, unable to answer. Denny suddenly found his voice again. "This neighborhood has always been for certain kinds of families. That's all. We were protecting our homes." "From what?" David asked. "From me, a homeowner who pays his taxes and mows his lawn?" "You know what I mean," Denny muttered. "I do know," David said. "I've known my whole life." More officers entered, taking photos and collecting evidence. David watched as they bagged the masks and the spray paint cans. One officer was carefully photographing the broken windows, measuring the damage. Outside, a news van pulled up. Word was spreading fast. "Senator," Sergeant Willis said, "there's press outside. Would you like us to handle them, or do you wish to make a statement?" Before David could answer, his phone rang. The caller ID read, "Governor's Office." "Excuse me," he said, stepping away to answer. "Hello, Governor." "Yes, I'm all right." "No injuries?" "Yes, they've been arrested." "I appreciate your concern." When he hung up, everyone was staring at him. The three attackers looked pale now, realizing the seriousness of what they'd done. "The governor sends his regards," David said to the room. "He's very interested in this case." Denny's face lost its last bit of color. "The governor knows about this?" "Breaking into a state senator's home tends to get attention," Sergeant Willis said coldly. As the officers began leading the men outside to waiting police cars, Denny looked back at David. "If we had known who you were, that's the problem," David cut him off. "You didn't try to know who I was. You saw what you wanted to see." Rick paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I am truly sorry, Senator Miller." David nodded. "Actions have consequences, Mr. Powell." Rick Powell. "Mr. Powell, maybe think about that next time, before you put on a mask." After the men were taken away, David stood in his damaged living room with Sergeant Willis and two remaining officers. Through the windows, he could see cameras flashing. As the arrested men were placed in police cars, "We'll have officers stationed outside your home for the next few days," Sergeant Willis said. "For your protection." "That won't be necessary," David replied. "With respect, Senator, it's standard procedure in cases like this." "And what kind of case is this exactly?" The sergeant chose her words carefully. "A targeted attack on a public official's residence." David shook his head. "No. This was three frightened men who didn't like seeing someone who looks like me living in a house like this. Let's not make it more complicated than it is." He walked to the broken front window and looked out at his new neighborhood. Faces stared back at him from across the street. None approached to offer help. None asked if he was okay. "Will you be all right here tonight, Senator?" an officer asked. "Is there someone who can come stay with you?" David thought about calling Zoe, but decided against it. She didn't need to see this. "Not yet. I'll be fine," he said. "This is my home. I'm not going anywhere." Police cars lined Hill Street, their lights painting the night in flashing blue and red. Neighbors stood in small groups, whispering behind their hands. Some had brought out phones to record everything. No one approached the house. Inside, officers finished taking photos and collecting evidence. David signed his statement while sitting at his dining room table, careful to avoid the shards of glass. "We'll have someone come board up these windows tonight," Sergeant Willis told him. "Can't leave the house open like this." "I appreciate that," David said, handing back the signed papers. Two more police cars pulled up outside. A man in a suit stepped out of one, ducking under the yellow police tape. David recognized him immediately. District Attorney Robert Hayes. "Here comes the cavalry," Sergeant Willis murmured. D.A. Hayes entered without knocking, his face grim. "Senator Miller, when I heard the address, I couldn't believe it." He shook David's hand firmly. "I want you to know we're taking this very seriously." "I understand," David said. "Hate crimes, breaking and entering, vandalism, threatening a public official. These men are looking at serious time." David nodded. "I just want justice, Robert. The same justice anyone else would receive." "Of course," Hayes said, though his expression suggested this case would get special attention. "The news vans are already setting up outside. This will be the lead story tomorrow." As if on cue, David's phone began ringing again. His chief of staff, Lisa Martinez. "Senator," she said when he answered. "I just heard. Are you all right? Do you need anything?" "I'm fine, Lisa, but we'll need to prepare a statement for tomorrow and reschedule my morning meetings." "Already done," she assured him. "The governor wants to hold a press conference with you at noon. Tell him I'll be there." After hanging up, David looked around at the officers still working in his house. They moved carefully, respectfully, as if in a museum. So different from the three men who had crashed through with hatred and baseball bats just an hour ago. D.A. Hayes stepped closer. "Senator, you should know that the men we arrested are talking. Seems the one named Powell is particularly eager to tell his side." "And what side is that?" David asked. "He claims he was trying to stop the others. Says he took off his mask and was attempting to intervene when we arrived." David thought about the man who had stood in his dining room, mask in hand, shame on his face. There might be some truth to that. "Still doesn't excuse his participation," Hayes said firmly, "but it might affect plea negotiations." Outside, a van pulled up with "Emergency Board-Up Services" painted on the side. Two men got out and began unloading plywood sheets. "We'll leave an officer stationed outside tonight," Sergeant Willis said. "Just to be safe." David started to object, but stopped himself. It had been a long night. "Thank you, Sergeant." As the police began to clear out, David stood on his front porch watching the board-up crew measure his broken windows. Across the street, neighbors still gathered, now in larger groups. News reporters attempted to get statements from them. A police officer approached, carrying a spray bottle and rags. "We've cleaned off most of the paint, Senator, but you'll probably want to repaint the garage door." David nodded his thanks, looking at the faint outline of hateful words still visible under the streetlights. Suddenly, a middle-aged woman broke away from the group of neighbors and approached the yellow tape. She looked nervous, clutching her robe closed at her neck. "Excuse me," she called. "Are you really a senator?" David stepped down from his porch. "Yes, ma'am. State Senator David Miller." Her face flushed. "I had no idea. We all just wondered who had moved in. Nobody told us." "Would it have mattered?" David asked gently. She had no answer for that. David turned as he heard the sound of a car speeding up the hill. A small blue sedan parked hastily, and a young woman jumped out, running, toward the house. "Dad!" Zoe called, ducking under the police tape despite an officer's protest. "Dad!" David met his daughter halfway, wrapping her in a tight hug. "Zoe, who called you?" "It's all over the news already," she said, tears in her eyes. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" "I'm fine," he assured her. "Just some broken windows." Zoe looked at the house, then at the neighbors still watching from across the street. Her face hardened. "Is this why you didn't tell them you were a senator?" she asked. "You wanted to see how they'd treat you as just another black man moving into their neighborhood?" David didn't answer right away. Instead, he put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, and led her toward the house. Behind them, the neighbors looked at each other with new understanding dawning on their faces. Sunrise painted the sky pink and gold over Hill Street. The police had finally left around 3 in the morning. The news vans remained, their satellite dishes pointed to the sky like strange metal flowers. David stood at his kitchen window, a cup of coffee warming his hands. Zoe had fallen asleep on the couch after insisting she wouldn't leave him alone. Now she was curled up under a blanket, her face peaceful in sleep. His phone buzzed with another text message, the 5th from the governor since dawn. Everyone wanted a statement. Everyone needed to be seen standing with the attacked senator. Outside, reporters stood on his lawn, pointing cameras at the boarded-up windows and the faint outline of hateful, words still visible on the garage door. Their voices drifted through the walls. Hate crime against State Senator David Miller. Neighbors say they had no idea a senator had moved in. 3 suspects in custody, facing multiple charges. David sighed and turned away from the window. On the kitchen counter, his laptop displayed headlines from news sites across the state. Hate crime at senator's home. Racist raid targets black lawmaker. Senator Miller attacked in own home. His phone rang. Lisa, his chief of staff. "Morning, Lisa," he answered quietly, moving away from the couch where Zoe still slept. "Senator, how are you holding up?" Lisa asked, concern in her voice. "I've had better nights," David admitted, "but I'm okay." The governor's office has issued a statement condemning the attack. They've scheduled a press conference for noon, as we discussed. "Do you still want to attend?" David looked at his reflection in the microwave door. He needed a shave. His eyes were tired. But there was work to do. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'll be there." "Your speech on housing reform is trending online," Lisa continued. "People are connecting last night's attack to your work on affordable housing in exclusive neighborhoods." David hadn't even considered that connection. He'd been focused on the simplest explanation, that 3 men had seen only his skin color, not his position or his policies. "The news cycle is moving fast," Lisa added. "This is becoming a bigger story by the hour." After hanging up, David walked to the living room where Zoe was beginning to stir. "Morning, Dad," she mumbled, sitting up and pushing her hair from her face. "Any news?" "Just the usual political dance," he said, sitting beside her. "Everyone wants to show they're on the right side of this." Zoe pulled the blanket around her shoulders. "What about the neighbors? Any of them brave enough to bring welcome cookies this morning?" As if answering her question, the doorbell rang. David and Zoe exchanged surprised looks. At the front door stood a middle-aged couple, the woman holding a plate covered in foil. "Senator Miller," the man said nervously. "I'm David Chen, and this is my wife Helen. We live 4 houses down." "We brought you some muffins," Helen said, holding out the plate. "And we wanted to say, we're so sorry about what happened." David accepted the plate with a nod. "Thank you. Would you like to come in? The place is a bit of a mess, I'm afraid." The Chens stepped inside, careful to avoid the small bits of glass still on the floor. Helen gasped softly at the boarded windows and damaged walls. "It's terrible what those men did," David said, looking genuinely disturbed. "We've lived here for 15 years. Nothing like this has ever happened." Zoe gave her father a knowing look over the Chen's shoulders. More neighbors arrived throughout the morning. Some brought food. Others offered to help clean up. A local hardware store owner promised free repairs for all the broken windows. By 1:11. David's kitchen counter was covered with dishes and cards. People who had watched from behind curtains yesterday now stood in his living room, shaking his hand, telling him how proud they were to have a senator in the neighborhood. Zoe watched it all with narrowed eyes. As the latest visitors left, she whispered to her father, "Funny how they all care now that they know who you are." "People are complicated," David replied quietly. "Fear makes us do strange things. So does shame." As noon approached, David went upstairs to shower and change for the press conference. He put on his best suit, the one he had worn when he was sworn in as senator. It felt like armor now. When he came downstairs, Zoe was waiting by the door, car keys in hand. "I'll drive." "You," she said. "You barely slept." Outside, the news crews perked up when they saw David emerge in his suit. Cameras turned, microphones extended. "Senator Miller, how do you feel about the attack?" "Senator, will you be moving after this incident? Do you blame the neighborhood for what happened?" David stopped at the top of his porch steps. Zoe, at his side. The cameras focused on his face, waiting for his response. "I'll be making a full statement at the Capitol in 30 minutes, he said clearly. "But I want to be very clear about one thing. This is my home. I'm not going anywhere." Reporters shouted more questions, but David and Zoe walked to her car without answering. As they drove down Hill Street, neighbors stood on their lawns, watching the senator pass by. Some waved. Some looked away. All of them wondered what would happen next in the big house on the hill. 1 week later, the big house on the hill looked almost normal again. New windows had replaced the broken ones. Fresh paint covered the garage door where ugly words had been sprayed. Workmen packed up their tools and drove away, leaving the house looking whole once more. But things had changed on Hill Street. David stood on his front porch, watching as cars slowed down to look at his house. Some were just curious. Others were supporters who had been bringing flowers and cards all week. A few reporters still camped at the end of his driveway, hoping for an update. His phone rang. It was Lisa. "The meeting at Jefferson Elementary is all set for tonight," she said. 7 o'clock. "We're expecting a big turnout." "I'll be ready," David promised. Inside, Zoe was arranging fresh flowers in a vase. She had extended her visit, taking a week off from college classes to stay with her father. "More flowers from the governor?" she asked as David came in. "These are from the neighbors across the street," he said. "The Wilsons. They brought them by this morning while you were sleeping." Zoe raised an eyebrow. "The same Wilsons who peeked through their blinds when we unloaded your moving truck." "Tofiri, very same," David nodded. "People can surprise you, Zoe." "Some surprises I could do without," she muttered, but her voice lacked real anger. David picked up the newspaper from the coffee table. His face looked back at him from the front page, standing at a podium with the governor. The headline read, "Senator Miller calls for unity after hate crime." The 3 men who had attacked his home were still in jail. Denny Miller had been denied bail due to the serious nature of the charges and his unrepentant attitude. Tom Barker had posted bail and was awaiting trial. Rick Powell had made a full confession and was cooperating with prosecutors. He had even written a letter of apology to David, explaining that he had grown up hearing certain ideas but had never really questioned them until that night. "Dad," Zoe called from the kitchen, "we should leave soon if you want to get to the school early." David changed into a fresh shirt and tie. Tonight wasn't an official Senate meeting. It wasn't a press conference. It was something more important, a community gathering at the local elementary school. He had called for it himself, surprising everyone. Not to condemn, but to connect. The parking lot at Jefferson Elementary was full when they arrived. People lined up outside the gymnasium doors, waiting to get in. When they saw David's car pull up, they parted to let him through. some reaching out to shake his hand. Inside, the gym had been set up with folding chairs in a large circle rather than rows facing a stage. David had been clear. This wasn't a speech. It was a conversation. As people filed in and took seats, David stood by the door, greeting each person with a handshake or nod. Some couldn't meet his eyes. Others gripped his hand too tightly, as if trying to prove something. Most just seemed curious. At 7 o'clock, with every chair filled and people standing along the walls, David walked to the center of the circle. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I know many of you are expecting me to talk about what happened at my home last week, about hatred and fear and anger." The room was completely silent, every face turned toward him. But tonight, I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about why I chose Hill Street for my home. He paused, looking around the circle of faces. "Many of you have brought welcome gifts this past week. I appreciate that. But I have to ask, why did it take an act of violence for those welcomes to arrive? Why did it take learning I was a state senator?" People shifted uncomfortably, in their seats. Some looked at the floor. "I'm not here to shame anyone," David continued. "I'm here because I believe in the power of understanding. So let me tell you a story about the house on the hill." David walked slowly around the inside of the circle as he spoke. 50 years ago, a young woman named Rose worked as a maid in that house. She cleaned its floors, washed its windows, and cared for the children who lived there. She was my grandmother. A murmur ran through the crowd. My grandmother walked to work each day because she wasn't allowed to live in this neighborhood. She would tell me stories about that beautiful house and how someday things would change. David stopped walking. She was harassed by neighbors, called terrible names. Eventually, she was forced to find work elsewhere, in another town. But before she left, she made a promise to herself that someday her family would live in a house like that we would belong. The room was so quiet now that the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. When I learned that the house where my grandmother once worked was for sale, I knew I had to buy it. Not just for me, but for her, to fulfill her dream. David looked around at the stunned faces. "So you see, I didn't choose your neighborhood by accident. I came home, to a place that was always meant to be part of my family's story." An older woman in the front row wiped tears from her eyes. A man near the back stood up. "Senator Miller," he said, his voice cracking. "My father owned that house in the 70s. If your grandmother was Rose Miller, I remember her. She used to sneak us cookies when my parents weren't looking," David smiled. "That sounds like her." More people began to share memories. Some had parents or grandparents who remembered Rose. The circle of chairs no longer seemed to divide people, but to connect them. As the meeting ended 2 hours later, people approached David not as a senator, but as a neighbor with deep roots, in a place they had thought he didn't belong. Outside, the night was clear and cool. Stars twinkled above Hill Street. The next morning, David and Zoe stood in the front yard with a small tree sapling and gardening tools. "Are you sure this is the right spot?" Zoe asked, digging into the soil. "Positive," David said. "My grandmother always said she wanted to plant a magnolia right here. She said it would be beautiful when it bloomed, visible from every house on the street." They worked together, placing the young tree in the hole, carefully adding soil around its delicate roots. "There," David said as they finished. "Now we've put down roots." Zoe leaned against her father's shoulder. "Grandma Rose would be proud." "Yes," David agreed, looking up at the big house on the hill. "She would be. A few neighbors walked by, waving and calling good morning. Not because he was Senator Miller, but because he was David. A man with a story that was now part of their shared history. A man who had finally come home. Thanks for listening to A Place Called Home. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from today. If you enjoyed this story about Senator David Miller and his journey, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more thought-provoking stories like this one. Each view and share helps spread these messages of understanding, resilience, and kindness. Remember, sometimes what appears as someone not belonging might actually be someone returning home. We all have deeper stories than what's visible on the surface. Drop your location in the comments below and let me know what you thought of the twist ending. Until next time, keep spreading kindness in your own neighborhood.